Morning everybody. As I mentioned in the previous video, is a short recap of my trip to Iceland. Sorry for my voice, but I do have a bit of cold. I usually don't plan my trips too precise. I do choose a direction, pack my essentials and hit the road. This time I had to spend more time on logistics because the weather window in Iceland is quite short. You've got 2 or 3 summer months that you can go there. It's good to book your ferry ticket as early as possible because the prices are lower and they might sold out. By the way, the tickets aren't the cheapest ones. The plan is to get through Germany, Denmark, onto a ferry. The ferry departs from Hirtshals in northern Denmark. I've planned to take 3 days to get to the ferry. It's about 101,000 kilometers, and I assumed that I would take some detours along the way to see some sights. And I did so, especially in Denmark, where I visited the tombs of Danish kings. I wanted to see another place with a lighthouse in the dunes, but the weather and the distance from the parking lot discouraged me from visiting it. Following the suggestion of a fellow rider, I went a bit further, and I think I found a much better place, a beach that you can drive on. On the cliffs above and on the beach itself there were also many bunkers from World War II, part of the Atlantic Wall. A very cool place to visit and have a ride on the beach, because there aren't too many beaches in Europe that you can ride on. The next day, Donkey and I set off on a 2.5-day cruise. One stop along the way on Faroe Islands. The islands themselves make a cool impression, like mountain peaks sticking out of the ocean. Donkey did survive the cruise better than I did. My stomach is trying to have a party, but the rest isn't. I'm not feeling too well. On the third day of the cruise, around 9 o'clock in the morning, we reached Scenic on the east side of the island. Welcome to Iceland! Wow, it already looks stunning. The weather wasn't the best to begin with, but for a start, no rain and few degrees Celsius wasn't bad. My first stop was Egilsstaðir, where I bought a local SIM card. The idea was to follow the route number 1, but as much as possible to use gravel roads. I headed north to visit a puffin colony near a place called Bakkagerði. Surprisingly, I was lucky enough to see a few of those charming birds. There's only one road to this spot, so I had the opportunity to admire the views from 2 perspectives, as I had to take a section of the same route back. Halfway back I turned onto a gravel road that led me to the ring road, but only briefly, as I chose a parallel gravel route on the other side of the river, heading west. I jumped on it briefly later to get to Route 901, which leads through desolated landscape with outworldly views. Back on the route number 1, and a powerful shower followed me to the next stop, Dettifoss waterfall. That's the power of the nature. Incredible. So much water. And one tip over here, there are fewer people on the eastern side, and you can get quite close to the waterfall from that side. Later that same day, I managed to reach Verir, an area still experiencing geothermal and seismic activity. I first visited the Krafla crater, then I returned to the springs, which have very intensive smell of rotten eggs. Be warned, the smell in my helmet lingered longer than I expected. Tired from a busy day, I chose a campsite beyond Lake Mývatn for the night. The next day I returned a dozen or so kilometers to the lake area because I wanted to see the Hverifjall crater. We'll see how fast can I get over there. It took me exactly 11 minutes. Almost made it in 10. With the view over the lake behind me. There are some people going around the volcano. Fortunately, the next point of interest wasn't far away, only a few kilometers, but exploring on foot was no longer an option. I viewed Dimabugir from the viewing terrace near the entrance and continued my journey. It was at this point that I started paying closer attention to the weather forecast. as it wasn't very optimistic for the area I was heading to. Winds up to 130 km per hour were forecasted for much of the western part of the island. I passed through beautifully situated Akureyri, and about 25-30 kilometers later,
I don't know if I want to risk it, because it's 58 kilometers more to the next town, and it's gonna be like that over there. It's very strong wind.
I decided that I don't want to fight for my life on the route, and found myself a cozy place in a guest house a little before Akureyri, where I spent the night. The next day, the first thing I did was checking the weather report on the local app. It turned out the wind had dropped a bit, so I quickly packed up and hit the road. I drove back through Akureyri and drove by the place that I turned back from the day before. After driving a few tens of kilometers, I stopped to refuel and bumped into a friend I'd met on the ferry, so we decided to travel together for a while. I booked a night at the same hostel that Mattia did, and we set off. We covered a good portion of route, made a few stops, refueled, and then entered the Westfjords. And here the wind began to play its tune again.
Yeah, I was pushing the right side, not to run away from the road.
We stopped for refueling and quick grocery shopping in Reykjavik and moved on further down the road. The last section of the route will stay with me for a long time because of the beautiful landscape and harsh conditions we encountered. We stopped for the night in a fishing village just north of Vjorgur. The wind had calmed down a bit, so I could see the beautiful surroundings without the fear of it blowing my head off. The next day we set off back to Reykjavik. As I mentioned it earlier, this is another destination with only one road leading to it. There were some clouds on the horizon, but overall the weather was bearable. On 2/3 distance on the way to Reykjavik, we were caught in a rather heavy, violent downpour. I arrived to Reykjavik soaking wet, with very little desire to continue riding. Hence we decided to head towards Reykjavik. After several hours of driving on tarmac, admiring the beautiful views from the road, countless micro and mini waterfalls, having lunch at the gas station and a short stretch on the gravel, we arrived to Reykjavik. A glance at the cathedral in city center, and we headed off to the hostel where we had the reservation. In the morning I said goodbye to Mattia and we set off on our separate ways. Mattia headed north and I headed south towards Grundavik, near which the last volcanic eruption had its place not long ago. Along the way, I took a quick detour to inhale myself with some rotten eggs. Then I visited a bridge over the tectonic plate fracture. I arrived near Grundavik to an abstract site. Very high walls made out of ground around the town and black fields of freshly hardened lava. I hadn't expected this. I thought it would be some small area, but instead hectares were covered in a black volcanic rock. I drove through a town where some residents probably hadn't returned yet, as many houses and businesses appeared to be closed. Dozens or so kilometers beyond the town, I turned off from a coastal road onto a dirt road that cuts through the peninsula. This turned out to be very picturesque, with a number of unusually shaped rocks and fields of intensely green moss. Another unforgettable route. I returned to tarmac near Reykjavik, skirted the city and headed east, towards the southern side of the island. After several kilometers I turned inland and headed towards Thingvellir National Park, where I had the opportunity to walk along the largest rift between the two tectonic plates, the European and the North American. From there I continued on to visit a place that gave the name geyser. It's a field of these steam-belching structures. Some have already ebbed, but there are others that still demonstrate the power of nature. After the spectacle, I headed south to the village of Yerbakki on the coast near Selfoss. where I spent the night in a hostel. Plan for the next day was simple: head into the interior of the island and do some gravel riding. The weather wasn't encouraging in the morning, but thankfully only on the approach to the actual trail. Then the views overshaded the unattractive aura. There was so much of them that it was difficult to choose which direction to look. And because of not paying attention to the road, I've landed on the ground. My ribs were a bit bruised, but nothing serious happened. I dusted myself off and continued on. The unforgettable views of the river and the volcanic crater did the trick. Then came the broccoli fields, a monologue with sheep, and short water crossing, thankfully without any swimming lessons. And that was the third route that will stick in my mind for a long time. Then back to the asphalt and towards the south coast. I visited Durholai Hill, followed by a quick hop around the area to another black sand beach where I could admire beautiful basalt rock formations. I ended the day at the campsite in Vik. My last full day in Iceland began with the favourable weather conditions, a light breeze, even a fair amount of sunshine and a temperature of 13 degrees Celsius. Not bad for a day so far. I set off eastbound on Route 1, passing several impressive waterfalls along the way. I visited a monolithic boulder in the middle of nowhere and stopped near a glacier, which impressed me even from afar as I approached. The next point I reached was also related to ice, specifically pieces of glacier that had broken off and floated in the blue lagoon. The ice comes from the lagoon, goes into the sea, and the tide is bringing it parts back to the beach. That's how those diamonds are created. Look a bit like a diamond. Time was running out, so I had to continue my journey. The further east I went, the worse the weather became. The strong wind returned and the temperature dropped. So on the last stretch of the route, I took a shortcut through the mountains to reach the area where I wanted to find an accommodation. Some decisions are regrettable, but this one I didn't regret. The route was quite bumpy, but the views made up for the discomfort. At the summit, the wind calmed down, the sun came out, and the beautiful sky appeared. In this weather, I reached the campsite near Egilstadir, where I spent my last rather chilly night in Iceland. The next day, all that remained was a short trip to the fjord where the ferry to Denmark departed. The morning was quite chilly but sunny. A final look at Iceland's beautiful landscapes, a breath of fresh air and a visit to the port.
Buongiorno ragazzi!
It's time to say goodbye to Iceland. I had a very good time over here, although the weather wasn't too good. I did saw a lot of beautiful stuff over here. Next 2 days on the ferry felt incredibly long, but thankfully I didn't experience any stomach issues. Denmark greeted me with beautiful sunny weather, quick unloading, filling up the donkey, and I was ready to hit the road home. After crossing the border into Germany, I stopped at the gas station. Fellow rider that was riding with me stopped there, and I was accompanied by 3 motorcyclists from Kuwait, which I also met on the ferry. I stopped for the night north of Hamburg, and the next day, after passing through several picturesque towns, I took the autobahn towards Poland. It was a very boring journey, but I didn't have much of an option, as I only left 2 days for the return trip.
Welcome back to Poland!
If anyone's planning a trip to Iceland, here's some information that might be useful. As I mentioned it in the beginning, the weather window in Iceland is quite short, unless you like some extreme challenges. The option ranges from late spring to early autumn, of course on Northern Hemisphere. In my case, I just had 2 weeks for the whole trip, so 3 days to get from Poland to Denmark, 2 days on a ferry, 7 days on the island, next 2 days back to Denmark, and 2 days back from Denmark to Poland. I have to say I had a budget for the trip. Not so strict, but there was an amount of money that I wanted to spend on the whole of the trip. And the biggest expense of the entire trip was the ferry ticket. It did cost €1,100 for a two-way ticket with a couchette. It wasn't super comfortable, but it was enough for me. If you own your own cabin, the price range goes from €1,500 up to 2,000 or even more. Depends on the location of the cabin on the ship. As for the accommodation on the island itself, I assumed I'm gonna stay in the tent or in some kind of hostels or guest houses. It all depends from the weather. Campings did cost about €20 a night, and hostel beds in dorms will range from €50 to €70 per night. Regarding the navigation, I did bought myself a SIM card in Egilstadir. It's the first so-called bigger town on your way from the ferry. It's about 35 kilometers from it. The SIM card costed about €10 and it was enough for the whole time on the island. Petrol stations are quite available on the island. It's not a problem to fill up your tank. There's quite a lot of self-service stations, so if you've got a credit card, you won't be having any issues with that. But you have to be aware that the distances between the petrol stations aren't like in Europe, every, 50 or 30 kilometers. It's more like 100 or 120, especially in the north side of the island. I didn't have any problems with that because Donkey've got 23-liter tank and the range is more than 500 kilometers on one tank. Total distance I've made from Poland to Denmark and then on the island and back from Denmark to Poland was 5,220 kilometers. Not bad for a 2-week trip. In matter of food, I did took some stuff with me, but it wasn't much of it. I assumed I'm going to Iceland to admire the nature over there. Not necessary to try the local cuisine. I simply shopped in supermarket once I got there. Although I tried some strange things, mostly from the grocery stores. I didn't took any souvenirs as such. I think that recordings are enough for me. Let's get to the numbers. I've got a spreadsheet over here. So the cost of the entire trip as follows. Ferry was €1,100, as I mentioned before. Petrol was €400. Accommodation was €450. Groceries about €270. Other things like parking, entrance fees, SIM card, some tickets, food on the ferry, €80. So the total cost was €2,300 for 2 weeks of trip. I've got 2 more infos. The first one is that most of the natural attractions are free to see, but you have to pay almost all the time for the parking. The price for the motorcycle parking was about 400 Icelandic crowns. It isn't much, but they do got some cameras on the entrance and when you're going out from the parking lot, so they're gonna know and they might send you a letter after your trip with a much higher price, I think. And the second thing is that you cannot fly drone everywhere, especially in national parks and in some very popular tourist attractions. There are some signs that the drones aren't allowed over there. The prices are from 2025. I don't know how they're gonna be in 2026. I've heard lately that they want to make some kind of tax. Concerns the distance of your trip on the island itself, and you're gonna have to pay for each kilometer. I don't know how much that tax gonna be, and I don't know if it's gonna concern motorcyclists or just for the cars. Haven't got a clue. I left one but very important thing for the end because it's worth the mention and not everybody's getting that under consideration. The weather. You have to be aware that the conditions there might change dozen or more times a day. You can have sunny day in the morning and 2 or 3 hours later it's gonna be a hailstorm or a very strong wind from the side that's gonna try to blow you off the road. I hope you enjoy all the series, and if you've got any questions, just leave them in the comments. That's it from me for today. So if you did like the video, give me a thumbs up, leave a comment, share the video, and don't forget to subscribe down below. See you next time.